Lorraine Whittaker was never supposed to be the center of the story. For years, she existed on the edges of public attention, glimpsed in fragments and frozen frames, her life flattened into thumbnails and captions. People talked about the Whittakers as a family, as an oddity, as a symbol of isolation and inbreeding, but Lorraine herself remained mostly silent in the public imagination. Then everything changed when the identity of Timmy's father was finally spoken out loud. Once that name surfaced, the entire story shifted weight. It stopped being abstract. It stopped being rumor layered on rumor. It stopped being speculation that could float forever without consequence. A name has gravity. A name forces questions to land. And when that happened, Lorraine's life could no longer be reduced to a background detail in someone else's narrative. What people are reacting to now isn't just the revelation itself. It's what that revelation implies about everything that came before it. Because Lorraine was not a woman with power. She was not someone with access to protection, education, or the ability to advocate for herself. She lived her entire life inside a narrow world shaped by geography, poverty, disability, and isolation. When people talk about her now, they often forget that context. They talk as if she had choices most of us take for granted. But choice looks different when your world is only a few dirt roads wide. For decades, Lorraine's existence was invisible. She lived in a place most people never visit and never think about. No schools passing by her door. No doctors checking in. No social workers asking questions year after year. Her life unfolded quietly, without witnesses, without intervention, without the kind of oversight that might have changed her trajectory. That silence is what makes the revelation so heavy. When the story of Timmy's father emerged, it didn't arrive as a dramatic confession or a courtroom document. It came through family testimony, through fragments of explanation offered by people who themselves live with limitations and trauma. And yet, those fragments were enough to crack the story open. Because once people understood that Timmy's existence was tied not just to inbreeding or isolation but to an act of violence, the entire narrative demanded to be re-examined. Lorraine was no longer just a woman living in poverty. She became a survivor whose story had never been told on her own terms. That realization unsettled people. It forced viewers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Suffering doesn't always announce itself in ways the outside world can recognize. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. Sometimes it exists in places no one is looking. Lorraine did not narrate her trauma for the camera. She did not stand up and explain what happened to her with the clarity audiences are used to. She did not give interviews filled with language about healing or justice. She remained who she has always been, a woman with limited speech, constrained communication, and a life shaped by dependency. And that's exactly why her story is so disturbing. When someone cannot fully articulate what happened to them, the world often responds by doubting that anything happened at all. Silence gets mistaken for absence. Confusion gets mistaken for consent. Disability gets mistaken for unreliability. But none of those assumptions hold up under scrutiny. Lorraine's life unfolded in a place where isolation was normal and oversight was rare. In communities like that, harm can happen without consequence simply because no one is watching. No one asks questions. No one connects dots. And when harm happens to someone with limited ability to report or understand it, accountability becomes almost impossible. This is what makes the revelation about Timmy's father feel less like a plot twist and more like a confirmation of everything people feared but couldn't quite name. It reframes the Whittaker story entirely. For years, the public discussion focused on genetics, on inbreeding, on how a family could end up so isolated and impaired. But those conversations often stripped away humanity. They turned people into explanations instead of individuals. Lorraine, especially, became background noise in a story that centered more on shock than understanding. Now, her life can't be pushed aside so easily. Because when you trace the timeline honestly, the pain didn't start with viral videos. It didn't start with internet attention or documentaries. It started decades earlier, in a moment that altered the course of her life forever, without anyone stepping in to stop it. And that realization forces a reckoning. It asks uncomfortable questions about how many people lived and died in similar conditions without ever being seen. It asks whether society only notices suffering once it becomes shareable. It asks why protection so often arrives after the damage is already done. Lorraine lived most of her life without the world watching. When the world finally did look, it didn't come gently. It came with cameras, opinions, donations, and strangers who felt entitled to her story. Her privacy vanished almost overnight, replaced by a kind of attention that offered sympathy but not safety. And then came the intervention. The state's decision to remove Lorraine from her home was framed as protection, and in many ways, it was. The conditions she lived in were undeniably dangerous. But protection came late, and it came with separation. By the time help arrived, it was impossible to undo decades of neglect, trauma, and isolation. So now people are left holding two truths at once. On one hand, Lorraine is safer than she was before. On the other, she lost the only world she had ever known. Safety did not come with closure. It came with rupture. This is why the story is exploding now. Not because people crave scandal, but because they are confronting the consequences of collective indifference. Lorraine's life reveals what happens when vulnerable people exist outside the reach of systems designed to protect them. Her story challenges the audience in a way few viral stories do. It doesn't offer easy villains or satisfying resolutions. It offers discomfort. It offers the realization that harm can persist for decades without intervention, and that even well-intentioned attention can cause further damage. As people react to the revelation about Timmy's father, it's important to remember who this story actually belongs to. It belongs to Lorraine, not to the internet, not to commentators, not to headlines. She is not a plot device. She is not an explanation for someone else's condition. She is a woman whose life unfolded in silence, and whose trauma is only now being acknowledged. What comes next matters, because this moment can become just another cycle of outrage and consumption, or it can become something more responsible. It can force a deeper conversation about how society treats people who cannot advocate for themselves, about how easily isolation turns into invisibility, about how often protection comes too late. Lorraine's story didn't explode because people love shocking details. It exploded because it exposed a failure that spans generations. And once that truth is seen, it can't be unseen. Once the father's identity entered the public conversation, people began asking the wrong question first. They asked who he was, where he lived, what kind of man he had been. Those questions feel natural, but they miss the deeper issue. The real question is how something so life-altering could happen to Lorraine without anyone noticing, intervening, or protecting her. Because Lorraine did not live in a world built to catch harm. She lived in a world where survival came before safety, where disability existed without services, and where isolation functioned like both a shield and a cage. The back roads of rural West Virginia did not offer the kinds of systems people assume are universal. There were no regular wellness checks, no consistent medical oversight, no educational structure that could have flagged vulnerability early. Lorraine's life unfolded outside the frame of institutions that might have recognized danger. That absence matters. When people imagine abuse, they often imagine dramatic moments followed by immediate consequences. They imagine police reports, investigations, interventions. But that model assumes visibility. It assumes the victim can communicate clearly. It assumes there are witnesses, records, or at least someone asking questions. Lorraine had none of that. Her communication was limited. Her world was small. Her dependence on family was total. And in environments like that, harm does not announce itself. It blends into routine. It becomes another unspoken burden carried quietly because there is no language, no space, and no support to process it. This is why the story feels so destabilizing now. Because people are realizing that the worst part may not have been the act itself, but the silence that followed it. Silence enforced not by choice, but by circumstance. According to family accounts, Lorraine did not come forward to authorities. There was no report filed. There was no investigation. That absence has led some to question whether the story is real, but that skepticism reveals a profound misunderstanding of how abuse functions in isolated, vulnerable communities. Reporting requires access. Reporting requires understanding. Reporting requires trust in systems that have likely never shown up for you. Lorraine had none of those things. And even if she had tried to speak, would anyone have listened? Would her words have been believed? Would her communication limitations have been interpreted as confusion instead of truth? These questions don't have comforting answers. The more people sit with Lorraine's story, the more they begin to understand that it is not unique. It is extreme, but it is not rare. Across rural America, people with disabilities live in conditions where oversight is minimal and accountability is distant. Harm can exist for years without consequence simply because no one is paying attention. This is the uncomfortable reality behind the shock. The revelation about Timmy's father did not create new pain. It revealed old pain that had been ignored for decades. It forced people to confront the idea that suffering can exist quietly, without drama, without headlines, until someone accidentally shines a light on it. And when that light finally came, it did not bring relief. It brought scrutiny. Lorraine's life was suddenly being examined by millions of strangers who had no relationship to her, no understanding of her limitations, and no responsibility for her well-being. Her trauma became a topic of debate instead of a reason for care. This is where the story becomes ethically complicated. Public awareness can be powerful, but awareness without context becomes voyeurism. When people learn about trauma after the fact, especially trauma involving someone who cannot speak for themselves, there is a tendency to fill in gaps with assumptions. Some assume guilt. Some assume complicity. Some assume exaggeration. And others assume that suffering must have been obvious if it were real. But suffering is not always visible, especially when it belongs to someone the world has already decided not to see. Lorraine's disability did not protect her. It exposed her. It made her easier to dismiss, easier to overlook, easier to exploit. And because she lived in a place where systems rarely reached, that exploitation could happen without consequence. People now want accountability. They want justice. They want answers. But justice has a timeline, and Lorraine's story exists mostly outside of it. The person identified as Timmy's father is no longer alive. There will be no trial, no confession, no official reckoning. What remains is responsibility. Responsibility to understand how this happened. Responsibility to acknowledge the failures that allowed it. Responsibility to stop treating stories like Lorraine's as anomalies instead of warnings. The public focus often drifts toward sensational details, but those details distract from the systemic truth. Lorraine's life was shaped by conditions that made harm more likely and protection less accessible. Poverty narrowed her world. Isolation removed witnesses. Disability silenced her voice. And neglect ensured no one came looking. When people say this story exploded, what they really mean is that it broke through denial. It shattered the comfortable belief that extreme harm would always be noticed, reported, and addressed. Lorraine's life proves otherwise. And then there is Timmy. Timmy is often discussed as evidence of genetics, as proof of inbreeding, as a visual representation of generational isolation. Rarely is he centered as a person born into trauma he did not choose. His existence is often debated as a fact, not considered as a consequence. If Lorraine's account is true, Timmy's life began with violence. That matters. Not because it defines him, but because it contextualizes the circumstances of his birth. It shifts the narrative away from blame and toward understanding. Timmy did not come into the world because of recklessness or moral failure. He came into the world because a vulnerable woman was harmed in a place where harm could hide. And that reality should change how people talk about both of them. The internet has a tendency to flatten stories into single explanations. For years, the Whittakers were explained through genetics alone. That explanation was incomplete. Now, some want to replace it with another single explanation, focusing only on assault. That too is incomplete. The truth is layered. Lorraine's life cannot be reduced to one event, just as the family's struggles cannot be reduced to one cause. Poverty, isolation, disability, neglect, and violence all intersected. Each one compounded the others. Together, they created a situation where suffering could persist unnoticed. This is why the story feels overwhelming. It doesn't offer a clean resolution. It doesn't present a villain who can be punished or a system that can be easily fixed. It reveals a slow, grinding failure that unfolded over decades. And now, people are left asking what should happen next. Awareness alone is not enough. Sympathy alone is not enough. Even outrage is not enough. If Lorraine's story means anything, it must lead to deeper questions about how society monitors the well-being of people who live far from institutions and power. Who checks on them? Who advocates for them? Who notices when something is wrong? Because waiting for viral attention is not a safety net. It is a last resort. Lorraine's life shows what happens when protection arrives only after damage is irreversible. When systems move too late to prevent harm and too abruptly to avoid further trauma. When help comes in the form of removal instead of support. The revelation about Timmy's father did not close a chapter. It opened one that demands reflection, restraint, and responsibility. This story does not belong to spectators. It belongs to a woman whose suffering was invisible for most of her life, and whose truth is only now being acknowledged. What matters now is how people choose to respond. Do they turn her trauma into content? Do they debate it endlessly without context? Or do they recognize it as evidence of a broader failure that deserves serious attention? Because Lorraine's story is not shocking because it is rare. It is shocking because it is possible. And the question that lingers after the revelation is not just what happened to her, but how many others lived similar lives without anyone ever knowing. Comment below what you think. As the story continued to spread, another shift happened quietly but decisively. The conversation moved away from Lorraine herself and toward the systems that failed to notice her for so long. People stopped asking only what happened and began asking how it was allowed to happen at all. That question has no single answer, because Lorraine's life sat at the intersection of multiple blind spots. Rural isolation is one of them. In places like Odd, West Virginia, distance is not just geographic. It is institutional. Services that exist on paper often do not reach people in practice. Social workers are stretched thin. Medical care requires transportation many families do not have. Educational systems struggle to monitor children who never fully enter them. When someone lives off the grid of formal oversight, their suffering can exist entirely outside the awareness of the state. Lorraine lived in that gap. Her disability made her dependent. Her dependence made her invisible. And invisibility made her vulnerable. This is the part of the story that unsettles people the most, because it challenges a deeply held belief that someone would have stepped in if things were truly bad. Lorraine's life suggests otherwise. It suggests that suffering can be normalized when it is constant, and that abnormal conditions can become invisible when everyone around them accepts them as just the way things are. People who grew up near the Whittakers have described the family as known but not understood. They were there but not engaged with. Familiar but distant. That kind of social proximity without involvement creates a dangerous illusion of oversight. Everyone assumes someone else is paying attention. No one is. And when the person at the center of that neglect cannot clearly articulate their needs, the neglect deepens. Lorraine did not have the language to demand help. She did not have the awareness to recognize what had happened to her as something that could be reported or challenged. Her world taught her to endure, not to question. That endurance is often mistaken for resilience. But endurance without choice is not strength. It is survival under constraint. The revelation about Timmy's father forced people to reevaluate the timeline of Lorraine's life. Suddenly, moments that once seemed neutral took on new meaning. Her silence no longer felt like mystery. It felt like weight. Her limited speech no longer felt quirky or strange. It felt like a barrier that kept her trapped inside experiences she could not name. And then there is the issue of consent, a concept often discussed abstractly but rarely applied carefully to people with intellectual disabilities. Consent assumes understanding. Understanding assumes education. Education assumes access. Lorraine had none of these in the way most people recognize them. Her ability to consent, to resist, or to report harm existed in a severely constrained space. That reality does not require villainizing anyone else in her life to acknowledge. It simply requires honesty. When someone with limited cognitive capacity is harmed, the harm does not always announce itself as trauma in recognizable ways. There may be no outward signs, no dramatic shifts, no visible aftermath. Life simply continues, altered but unacknowledged. That is what makes Lorraine's story so difficult to process. There was no turning point where help should have obviously arrived. There was only a long stretch of time where nothing happened. Until suddenly, everything happened. When the family became known to the world, the reaction was not gentle. The attention did not come with understanding or restraint. It came with judgment, curiosity, and assumptions. People analyzed Lorraine's expressions. They speculated about her past. They debated her credibility without ever considering her capacity. This is one of the quiet harms of viral attention. It treats everyone as equally able to participate in public discourse. It assumes that if someone appears on camera, they are fair game for analysis. Lorraine was never equipped for that. Her trauma became public property without her consent, debated by people who will never bear the consequences of being wrong. That alone would be damaging. But it became even more complicated when intervention followed exposure. The state's involvement did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the context of public scrutiny, media attention, and growing concern about the family's living conditions. In many ways, the intervention was overdue. The conditions were unsafe. The risk was real. But the timing matters. When intervention comes late, it rarely feels like rescue. It feels like loss. For someone like Lorraine, whose entire world was defined by familiarity, removal from that world, even for safety, can feel like punishment. Safety does not automatically translate to comfort. Clean rooms do not erase fear. Regular meals do not replace emotional anchors. This is the contradiction at the heart of Lorraine's story. Protection and harm are no longer opposites. They coexist. She may be physically safer now, but she has lost autonomy, familiarity, and connection. She has been separated from the people she knew, even if those relationships were imperfect or strained. And she likely does not fully understand why any of this happened. People often ask whether it would have been better for the state to intervene earlier. The answer is yes, but not in the way most imagine. Earlier intervention does not mean removal. It means support. It means services. It means monitoring without disruption. It means helping families before conditions become crises. It means recognizing vulnerability before harm occurs. Lorraine never received that kind of intervention. She lived in a space where help only arrived when the situation became impossible to ignore. And now her story is being used as evidence of both neglect and overreach. Some argue the state waited too long. Others argue it acted too harshly. Both perspectives can be true at once. What is clear is that Lorraine's life was shaped by systems that either did not reach her or arrived only when the damage was done. This realization has changed how many people view the Whittaker story as a whole. It is no longer just about shock or curiosity. It is about responsibility. Responsibility to question why rural communities remain so underserved. Responsibility to examine how disability is treated outside urban centers. Responsibility to recognize that visibility should never be the prerequisite for protection. Lorraine's story has forced viewers to confront the uncomfortable truth that many lives unfold beyond the reach of safeguards people assume are universal. And that truth is harder to sit with than any sensational detail. Because it means Lorraine is not an exception. She is a warning. Her life demonstrates what happens when vulnerability intersects with neglect, when isolation replaces oversight, and when disability becomes a reason for exclusion rather than care. As people continue to discuss the revelation about Timmy's father, it is crucial not to lose sight of the bigger picture. This is not about assigning blame after the fact. It is about understanding how harm can persist quietly when no one is looking closely enough. Lorraine's story does not offer closure. It does not provide justice in the way people want. It provides clarity, and clarity can be painful. It shows that suffering does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like routine. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like a life that never intersected with help until it was too late. And now that the story has exploded, the responsibility shifts again. Not just to feel empathy, but to consider what must change so that stories like Lorraine's are not only noticed after they become unavoidable. Because once you understand how her life unfolded, the question is no longer why this happened. The question is how many times it has already happened without anyone ever knowing. By the time people reach this point in Lorraine Whittaker's story, something usually changes in how they feel. The shock fades. The outrage quiets. What's left is discomfort. Not the kind that pushes you to look away, but the kind that forces you to sit with questions that don't have easy answers. Because Lorraine's story does not resolve cleanly. There is no courtroom moment. There is no confession that brings relief. There is no ending where everything is made right. Instead, there is a life that unfolded largely unseen, shaped by forces far bigger than any single person, and altered permanently long before the world ever noticed. When people talk about the revelation of Timmy's father, they often frame it as the moment the truth came out. But that framing is misleading. The truth did not suddenly appear. It had been there all along, buried under silence, isolation, and neglect. What changed was not the truth itself, but the world's willingness to look at it. And even now, looking does not mean understanding. Understanding requires resisting the urge to simplify. It means acknowledging that Lorraine's life cannot be reduced to one event, no matter how traumatic. It means recognizing that her story is not just about abuse, or poverty, or disability, but about how those forces combine when no one intervenes early enough. Lorraine lived in a space where harm could exist without being named, where survival replaced self-determination, and where protection was conditional on visibility. Her life challenges the comforting belief that systems will always catch the most vulnerable before it's too late. They didn't catch her. By the time intervention arrived, the focus had shifted from prevention to containment. Safety became the priority, but safety came at the cost of familiarity and autonomy. Lorraine was removed from the only environment she had ever known, not because she suddenly became vulnerable, but because her vulnerability finally became undeniable. That distinction matters. It means the problem was never new. It means the conditions that shaped her life had existed for decades. It means the failure was not sudden, but slow and cumulative. People often ask whether the intervention was right or wrong. That question misses the point. The more important question is why intervention was delayed until no other option remained. If Lorraine had received support earlier, real support, not surveillance, her life might have looked different. If someone had checked in consistently, if someone had asked the right questions, if someone had recognized that disability combined with isolation creates extreme risk. But none of that happened. And now, the conversation risks repeating the same mistake in a different form. Lorraine's story is being consumed, debated, and analyzed by people far removed from the reality of her life. Her trauma is being discussed as a revelation rather than a responsibility. Responsibility is harder. Responsibility means asking what changes need to happen beyond this one story. It means questioning how many other people live in similar conditions right now. It means recognizing that viral attention is not a solution. It is often a symptom of systemic failure. Lorraine did not ask to become a symbol. She did not ask for her past to be dissected. She did not ask for her life to be reframed through headlines and commentary. She lived quietly, enduring circumstances she likely did not have the language to challenge. And that endurance has been misread too many times as acceptance. One of the most damaging myths surrounding stories like Lorraine's is the idea that silence equals consent or contentment. In reality, silence often signals the absence of alternatives. When someone has never been offered help, they do not know to ask for it. When someone has never been protected, they do not imagine protection is possible. Lorraine's life existed within those limits. Now that the world knows more, the risk is that attention will move on without accountability. That the story will fade after the emotional peak, leaving nothing changed for the next person living in similar conditions. This is where the audience matters. Not as spectators, but as participants in shaping what comes next. Because public attention can either pressure systems to improve or reinforce the cycle where harm is only addressed once it becomes impossible to ignore. Lorraine's story should not be remembered as shocking. It should be remembered as instructive. It shows what happens when rural poverty is treated as inevitable rather than solvable. It shows what happens when disability services fail to reach isolated communities. It shows what happens when protection is reactive instead of proactive. And it shows the human cost of waiting too long. There is also a responsibility to be careful with judgment. It is tempting to search for someone to blame, someone whose actions can be isolated and condemned. But Lorraine's story does not fit neatly into that framework. The harm she experienced was enabled by neglect more than malice, by absence more than action. That does not make it less serious. It makes it harder to address. Because preventing stories like Lorraine's requires investment, attention, and long-term commitment. It requires reaching people before crisis points. It requires valuing lives that exist far from cameras and headlines. It requires believing that dignity is not something people earn by being visible. As the conversation continues, it is worth asking what Lorraine would have needed at different points in her life. She needed oversight, not surveillance. She needed support, not scrutiny. She needed protection, not pity. And she needed it long before her story ever reached the public. The revelation about Timmy's father has changed how people view the Whittaker family, but it should also change how people think about vulnerability more broadly. This is not an isolated tragedy. It is a reflection of gaps that still exist. Those gaps are not abstract. They are geographic. They are economic. They are institutional. And they are human. Lorraine's story does not end with clarity. It ends with responsibility being handed to everyone who now knows it. What people choose to do with that knowledge matters. Will it become another moment of outrage that fades? Will it become another piece of content consumed and forgotten? Or will it become a reason to demand better systems for people who cannot demand them for themselves? Because Lorraine's life reminds us of something uncomfortable but essential. Suffering does not always announce itself. Sometimes